So welcome everyone. As I said a few seconds ago, this is our second net workshop as we're tagging our workshops this year at the network that we're hosting this week. This one is specifically on the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, ESSHI, year 6. We're very excited about. So for those of you I don't know, McLean Bearhopt, I'm the Associate Executive Director at the network, and I'm going to be your host today, helping to moderate the discussion. As I think everyone probably on this call knows, in 2016, the governor made a major announcement to develop 20,000 new units of supportive housing across the state over 15 years. And as I said, we're just starting year 6, so very exciting. It's shocking to me that this was 6 years ago at the network. We were advocating for, I guess it would be then 9 years ago, we started advocating for a new agreement. So super great to be here today with everyone. And so we have with us Rick Umholtz, who is a friend of the network and a member of the ESSHI Interagency Workgroup. And he's going to be walking us through today just sort of how ESSHI has gone over the last 5 years and talk about some things to expect moving forward. And Rick, as you said, if there's other members of the ESSHI Interagency Workgroup on the Zoom here today in the meeting, feel free to chime in at any time and add to the conversation. I think the way we'll start out is Rick is going to give sort of an overview presentation just to give some context and background. And then the second part of the workshop, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So I would just encourage you, as you think of questions, feel free to type them in the chat. And then when we open it up, I'll kind of run through and help moderate and ask the questions. And so just as you think of things, go ahead and fill that in and we can get to it in the second part. We're also recording this session, so if you have colleagues that couldn't join today, we will be sending this out, as well as the one that we did a few days ago, so you have both recordings of that to share with your colleagues. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Rick, I think I'll hand it to you to kick us off.
Thanks, McLean. Let me first start with thanking everybody on this call, many of our colleagues who haven't joined us on 2 different fronts. First and foremost, assisting, being on the front lines and navigating the pandemic. I can't thank you enough. Many of you already have operational projects, which means the world to the folks that are living there, to us. And keeping our fellow New Yorkers safe during the pandemic and really taking on a new front and hitting those challenges head on is amazing. It's a testimony to your passion, to everything that you stand and your agency stands for. So thank you from that front. I'd also like to thank you for bringing us to where we are. Right, we've turned the corner from year 5 as we focus on year 6 on the ESSHI work group, and many of us can reflect on kind of year 1 and said, "Oh my goodness, are we going to get there by year 5, by year 10, by year 15?" And the answer is yes, without a doubt. I can remember earlier conversations with McLean and said, "This is great. Are we going to do it?" Everybody said yes, and indeed we have. So thank you on that front as well. In full disclosure, in my office here, I'm joined by Jason Harper. I'll spin the camera so he can wave.
Good morning, everyone.
So that folks know that Jason's with us. And you saw Tom Lemoyne, who works on a number of different issues. He's joined us here in the office. But let me start with a little bit of an overview, and then I'll ask my colleagues from the work group if they want to open up and say hi too. But just to level set, what is ESSHI and kind of why we're here? The Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, as McLean mentioned, is part of the governor's overall supportive housing plan. The supportive housing plan largely puts out there a commitment to develop 20,000 units of supportive housing over 15 years. We kind of do it in benchmarks of 5-year blocks to really take notice. And this does mark us entering in year 6. The way ESSHI is administered, again, within the context of the supportive housing, is OMH serves as the lead procurement agency, and Moira sends her apologies for not being able to join us today. And in that role, OMH, issues the procurement. However, the procurement is not restricted to just mental health, and we'll get into more details. Moira also serves as the chair of our work group, or the Interagency Workgroup, which reports directly to the governor's office and DOB. The work group includes representation from the Department of Health, including the AIDS Institute, our colleagues HCR, or New York State Homes and Community Renewal, OASIS, the Office of Children and Family Services, OCFS, Office of Mental Health. So Moira serves as the chair, but also there's representation from our colleagues at OMH as part of the work group as well. Also included in the work group is the Office of Prevention and Domestic Violence, OPDV, us, OTDA, as well as our colleagues from the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities. So I'm going to pause there. And if we have ESSHI work group members, if you want to introduce yourself and give a little hi, that'd be great.
Hey, Rick, it's Julie Duncan from OMH. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining.
Great. Anybody from DOH or AIDS Institute? No? HCR?
Michelle's here.
Great. Hello, Michelle. OASIS? Maybe not. OCFS? I know Kathy's here.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Kathy Jones, and I'm with the Office of Children and Family Services, and I represent the youth and young adult population. It has been a pleasure to be on the committee for 6 years.
Awesome. As I mentioned, Jason's here from OTDA, as well as myself, and OPWDD. Trish?
Hey, Rick, this is Trisha Downs from OPWDD. I'm the statewide supportive housing coordinator over at our agency. We've been involved for a number of years, not from the beginning, but for a number of years. And we're glad to see that this program is moving forward as an important option for folks.
Thank you, guys. So as questions come up, I invite you, all of our colleagues, to jump in where needed or as needed. So again, just kind of a refresh. ESSHI, since its inception, has advanced annually requests for proposals, RFP, that is really targeting kind of the services and operating of supportive housing. We elected to do it annually because that allowed us to make adjustments along the way and kind of recalibrate the RFP as times change, as needs change in the program. So we have advanced 5 years of an RFP. I'm proud to say that from the larger context of the supportive housing plan, that over 7,500 units have received support from the state for the development as we speak today, and that number grows. And of that 7,500, there's been over 4,450 units which are attributable to ESSHI. So the projects are receiving services and operating from ESSHI. So as many of you know, each year that RFP advances a commitment of making at least 1,200 units committed, and it is dependent on our application process, but also securing the necessary capital to bring a project to fruition. The RFP that we advance, is asks for and is dependent on what the needs in the community are telling us. So it's very much fundamentally grounded in kind of the needs of the community, driven by the needs of the community. There are sections in there, or there's a section that obviously there's a cost evaluation to it, and also a readiness where, where is the project? But you don't have to, under ESSHI, it doesn't have to be a true shovel-ready project. It can be in a conceptual stages. For many of us who've been around the block, one of the successes of ESSHI, in my opinion, is it really solved which came first, the chicken or the egg, because I wear two hats, not only ESSHI and services, but also capital. And many times the capital funder wants to see the security around services and operating. And sometimes our services program wants to see the project that has commitment of development. That's the old days. This really kind of struck that middle ground, that you didn't have to have the capital commitment. And it could be in conceptual stages, which then you could use the services and operating to leverage those capital commitments. Our old RFP, the mechanics around it, once the applications were submitted to us, they went through a review process that ultimately led to funding recommendations. And then from that, conditional awards were advanced. Our old RFP put a timeline out there of 12 months. So once you received a conditional award, applicants had 12 months then to leverage the full commitment for capital. A bit of a foreshadowing for our new RFP. We really hear and listen to folks, and we understand kind of the constraints around some of the capital and the evolution of the programs and aligning that. So I think in year 6, when we advance that RFP, I think you'll see a change to that. And as we mentioned earlier this week, we're moving to a 24-month conditional award period. So that will allow our applicants a period of 24 months to secure 100% of the financing or the capital for the projects. Let's see. So as I mentioned, the ESSHI is governed by the work group, where we meet every Tuesday. I think we can count on one hand the Tuesdays that we haven't met. We've met all throughout the pandemic. And I point to this as being one of the successes of ESSHI, because if you have a project that involves multiple state agencies, every Tuesday we're meeting to talk about projects, the projects that are advancing, but it's also an opportunity to remove impediments or barriers to projects advancing. Our colleagues with all of the state agencies, we now have a forum to regularly discuss projects, where they are in development, and sort of any impediments, and also brokering the conversations around those. So every Tuesday we meet. It's also the time that when we meet on those Tuesdays, where all the state contracting agencies advance conditional awards. So there's a 2-step project process, as I mentioned, that you get a conditional award. Once you demonstrate to the state contracting agency 100% of the capital financing, that state contracting agency brings the project to a Tuesday meeting and discusses the project, outlines the total project costs, as well as the capital financing behind it, a projected opening date. And then from there, there's essentially a vote that happens to advance that project to a final award. Once it's approved by the Interagency Workgroup, OMH will issue a final award letter to that our community partner, our not-for-profit, that essentially establishes that final award. And the expectation that that money has been reserved for, contract negotiations when it's time to negotiate that contract. All of the state agencies have adopted the ideal, which is that a contract will be executed 90 days prior to the project opening. That allows for kind of startup, onboarding some staff, to the extent that supplies are needed, to really kind of bring that project to the opening date. So with that, I think one of the key takeaways that I always encourage from conversations like this is that many partnerships are established throughout the process. Sometimes the not-for-profit is also the developer. Sometimes someone else is the developer, and we have service providers that are doing service providers providing the services in a project being developed, not by their agency. One of the keys for our ESSHI providers is to have an active voice and stay in the conversations throughout the development. The obvious reason is so we know when to trigger contract negotiations to advance it to contract execution. But the second reason that I like to highlight is our service providers really can help in the design. There may be designs of a particular project that needs to be contemplated based on the target populations. So it's really important to kind of have that active voice throughout the development of the project. Just as a reminder in terms of kind of who's eligible to be served under ESSHI, it's all the populations that all the state agencies kind of are charged with ensuring services and providing for. That includes SMI individuals and households managing SMI, SUD, persons living with HIV/AIDS, victims and survivors of domestic violence, military service members with disabilities, chronic homelessness as defined by HUD, young adults and youth who have left the foster care system, reentry population, as well as frail, elderly, senior, and individuals with IDD. So those are the target populations that are eligible for which projects can or applicants can apply for projects to serve. And again, just a bit of a refresh on the definition. One of the common denominators in serving all of those populations is the target population must meet the state's homeless definition or ESSHI's homeless definition, which is a bit more expansive than a true kind of HUD definition. And again, I'm going to read the homeless definition that came up in our last session. In order to be considered homeless for the purposes of ESSHI, an individual must meet one of the following criteria: be an undociled person, whether alone or as a member of a family, who is unable to secure permanent housing and stable housing without special assistance. This includes those who are inappropriately housed in an institution, institutional facility, and can safely live in the community, and those and it can be young adults, survivors of domestic violence, individuals with IDD who are at risk of homelessness. 2, the individual target population can be a youth or young adult who has left foster care within the prior 5 years and who was in foster care at or over the age of 16 and who is without permanent stable housing. 3, be an adult or young adult re-entering the community from incarceration or juvenile justice placement who is released or discharged and who is without permanent and stable housing, or be a young adult between the ages of 18 and 25 without permanent residence, including those aging out of residential school or individuals with an intellectual or developmental disability. So it's really important in terms of the homeless definition that we recognize kind of at-risk factors, which include some of those institutional settings. So as we mark the 6th year, as I mentioned, over 7,500 supportive housing state funds have been committed, of which 5,450 are attributable to ESSHI or have ESSHI. And January 2022 really marks the first slate of contracts that are up for renewal. So the way ESSHI works is contracts are negotiated when you hit that stage for a 5-year block. They include a 2% escalator. And then those 5-year contracts then can be renewed, right? We don't want to destabilize any great work that we've done. And 2022 marks the first slate of contracts that are due for a renewal. So what does that feel like? That's something new. We haven't been there, uncharted territory. So each of our state contracting agencies will conduct a review of the not-for-profit, our community partner, and certify to its eligibility for renewal. And that certification goes to OMH, which ultimately is registered against the OSC procurement record. And that review will consist of performance, a fiscal review, a capacity review, and assuming satisfaction, it'll consider any factors if there's been site visits, claiming habits and that sort of stuff. So assuming satisfactory renew, agencies will enter into a new 5-year term. So I've gone through quite a bit. McLean, I don't know if I left anything out. I did my best to kind of fill some of Moira's remarks as well. So maybe I'll pause here, invite my colleagues. If I missed anything that we want to bring forward, but certainly I'll pause here.
Great. Does anyone else from the committee have anything to add to the overview?
This is Julie. I just want to mention for OMH providers that contract renewal process is already in place. So it won't be any different than what you already experienced, which actually I think, the behind the scenes review is largely, blind to the provider. So, we do that on our end. It shouldn't require any work on providers' ends.
I should have mentioned in terms of some of my opening remarks that in terms of applications in the review process, when applications come in, they're assigned to 3 state agencies for a review. And that's largely dictated by the target populations. And once the review process, the reviewers score out or evaluate the applications, there's a reconciliation process that ensures that there's a fair, objective evaluation on the application. Once we've achieved that, we advance it ultimately for approval, recommendation, and those awards those conditional awards are then advanced and issued. Generally, that process takes about a 3-month process from the due date of which the applications are submitted to the state.
Great. I'm going to jump in just with some questions that came to mind as you were talking, Rick, and I would encourage others to, if you think of questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure to get them all asked. Also, you can also raise your hand. We'll monitor that way as well if you'd like to ask a question and feel like it needs a little bit more context or detail than in a chat message. But one thing I was wondering about, Rick, is we have the existing conditional awards for year 5 that are out there. And I believe that most of them, if not all of them, were given an extension because of the pandemic last year. That's coming to a close. How should people be thinking about, if they have a year 5 conditional award, should they be applying to year 6? Should they be applying for an extension? Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to think that this year's RFP, as I mentioned, one of the things that we're modifying is we're moving to a 24-month conditional award, by which, that's the time that's permitted to secure 100% of the capital. I think there will be some other advancements in this RFP based on our 5-year look back, and really hearing from you all. One of the things that I think I missed the most is pre-pandemic, we had opportunities to travel about the state and have like forums and really hear about some suggestions and some recommendations to ensure that ESSHI was working in our communities and working for you. I think this year's RFP tries to advance some of those while balancing kind of the state's needs. That being said, the year 6 RFP will govern the conditional awards that are being made at that time. So anybody who has a round 5, we also extended the round 4 conditional awards. And I think all of those conditional awards are due to sunset at the end of this year, maybe the beginning of 2022 in January or February or something like that, is the round 5 sunset. I would encourage everybody to apply for the round 6, because one of the things we can't do is any of the flexibilities that we extend in year 6 can't retro to the prior commitments. So, each year's RFP kind of governs that slate of conditional awards. So I highly recommend everybody apply. I've also, there have been times that we know of entities that anticipated all of their capital being financed within that 12-month period, and for one reason or another that didn't come to fruition, which left a gap for them because they didn't apply in a subsequent ESSHI RFP. Kind of extensions were exhausted, and it really kind of put the project into question. So I always recommend erring on the side of caution to give yourself and the project the greatest flexibility to advance forwarding. So yeah, I would say apply.
Another question that came in around this 24-month period is just a question about, like, when does it sort of begin and end? And I suspect, Rick, folks want to know when they should expect the RFP to be coming out. So, which would be a trigger date for some of that, because you talk a little bit about the timing of, when the RFP is posted and how long to apply and then how long it takes, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. So we're anticipating advancing the RFP soon. I know the follow-up question to that, McLean, is what does soon mean, right? I think we said earlier this week, we're hopeful at the end of July to advance the ESSHI RFP. That gives us a couple weeks. Could it slide into the first week of August? Things happen, sure. But in the next couple weeks, that's our intent, is to advance it. From that, we usually leave the RFP out on the street somewhere around 40 days, 45 days, 50 days. It's varied over the last 5 years. That allows ample time to apply under ESSHI. And then from when the due date happens, it usually takes all of our colleagues among us and getting the reviews approved through our clearance process, normally about 3 to 4 months, which really aligns with the sunsetting of this year's conditional awards. As I mentioned, I think round 4 was extended through December. Round 5 sunsets at the end of January, maybe. So it puts us right on the same timeline to get new conditional awards out there. Those new 24-month conditional awards would commence at the issuing of the conditional award letter. So if we get them out, in January of 2022 or the end of this year, that's when the 24-month clock would start for those conditional awards.
Okay, great. Another question that came in was around the rate. It has, I think from the very beginning, year one, it was up to $25,000 per unit statewide. Is there any consideration or thought to that increasing, staying the same? And then just going forward, I mean, we're really talking about a 15-year program, right? For all intensive purposes. Is the state considering increasing rates over time, or just looking at the 2% escalator? Any comments you can make around the rates, I think would be helpful.
Sure. Well, the good news is the 2% escalator remains in effect, and it carries over into year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So unlike some of our other programs, those of you who are spending time with us and who are night shift providers, just a shameful reminder that applications are due tomorrow, July 16th for night shift. But some of our other programs and a lot of the other programs do not have an escalator. So we are fortunate under ESSHI. At this time, there is not consideration of adjusting the 25,000 maximum allowance, at least for year 6. I'm not going to share kind of comments of out years because it's largely predicated on the state budget and kind of where we are fiscally. But for year 6, we're not contemplating an increase.
Okay. Another question that came in is from Linda. Can you share what were the other state funds that were allocated to support the total 7,500 units in addition to the ESSHI funds?
Sure. So let me just kind of be clear. On the 7,500, there's a subset of that, which is the 5,450 or so units. That ESSHI is a subset of that 7,500. There are projects, right, that utilize capital financing for the development, but are not dependent on ESSHI for services and operating. Most commonly, we may see that in New York City, as they have 1515 funds down there. So, but that's, again, from a statewide lens and, wearing my HJP hat, it's very much supportive housing that's being developed. However, the services and operating just aren't dependent on ESSHI. And while we're talking about kind of capital, ESSHI, there's a variety of capital financing that supports our ESSHI projects that we've seen over the last 5 years. There's certainly projects that are privately financed, conventional loans. There's projects that pull multiple capital funding sources together. Our colleagues at HCR, our Homeless Housing Assistance Program, HHAP, we do a lot of joint venture projects together that also leverage additional capital financing. And then there are projects that are only dependent on some of the financing, the 4%, 9% multifamily funding that HCR has. And then there are projects that are also 100% financed by our Homeless Housing Assistance Program. So there's a variety of ways by which kind of capital is secured. Oasis on the phone has a number, I don't know if they're on, but they have a number of projects, generally smaller in nature and more rural, that are conventional alone. And through the services and operating, they're able to pay back the debt on the conventional loan from that rental subsidy component of ESHI while providing the necessary services. So there's really there's no right or wrong approach to that capital campaign and how to finance a project.
Yeah, and to that, on the capital side, Rick, can you speak a little bit to like when someone gets a conditional award and they had 12 months, now they're going to have 24 months to get all their capital lined up before that moves to a permanent award status. Do they have to have 100% of their capital lined up? Can they have 50%? Can they have one source, not all sources? What is the requirement there that people need to move to permanent?
Sure. The requirement is 100% of the financing commitment. And it's in the definition of a commitment that can take a variety of forms. It can be a soft commitment depending upon that funding source and the mechanics, which, there may be a board process, a board approval process in place. It could take the form of an award letter. HJP generally advances a conditional award letter or tentative award reserve. So it really does take, a different form depending upon that capital commitment. But there has to be evidence provided to a state contracting agency that gives some sort of confidence that the project has 100% of the capital funding committed or in process of commitment. 100% means 100%. It's not 99, 98. And during the 12-month conditional award process, if you had 80%, but there was a determination, you had an application that was being considered by a funder, we did permit the ability to request an extension until that determination has been made. So there have been instances over the past 5 years where that's been helpful. I see Jason here wants to add his thoughts around this.
Just everything Rick said is perfect. I just wanted to add that over these 5 years now, there has occasionally been some confusion about you can't lock in until you've closed on all your funding, and I want to make sure it's understood that is not the case. You do not have to have, the time frame is to just get some type of commitment in writing that all of your capital funders to develop the entire project, in addition to just the ESHI units, the entire project are going to work with you towards closing for a certain dollar amount on a specific project. So you do not have to close first within that time period.
Right.
I just want to reiterate that.
And part of sometimes the closing, and I'll invite if Michelle wants to add, sometimes some of our funding colleagues want to see that final award commitment as part of their closing document package. So that's why ESHI was designed flexible enough to kind of meet everybody's needs, hopefully.
There's a question.
Michelle unmuted. So did you want to say something, Michelle?
Oh, yeah, Rick, I was just going to confirm that, right? That we look for the final lock-in letters and commitment letters to be in place for closing and not the other way around.
Great, thank you for that clarification. There's a question about projects associated with ESHI on the capital side. Does it have to be a couple things? Does it have to be all new construction? Could it be used to rehab an existing building? Could it be for existing affordable units that want to transition to supportive? Can you address all sort of aspects of that question?
Sure. And I'm going to start with the best thing to do, prior to the RFP going out, is to loop back. I see a lot of familiar folks on the phone. So the state contracting agency that maybe you would regularly work with, or you can reach out to myself or Julie at OMH or Moira to have a conversation about a particular dynamic, and we can kind of talk through it. But just to be clear, that ESHI is charged with creating new supportive housing units. Does that mean that, you know, a vacant building that needs, that can include, I should say, let me do the positive, that can include renovating and rehabbing a vacant building, or a building that needs significant rehab, and then placing it back in line in a supportive housing approach. So what ESSHI can't do is, if you have a transitional housing project that you're receiving transitional funding in support of, and you know, the decision is made, we want to convert it from transitional to permanent housing because ESSHI has a better subsidy, or it just seems a little bit more lucrative. Really, there's not an expansion of services in that community. So kind of that measure, if you will, when we approach kind of the uniqueness of different situations and projects, is at the end of the day, funding it through ESSHI, is there additional services being provided in the community? That's kind of that litmus test that we use.
Great, thank you.
I also, what comes to mind, and I don't know if I saw this come up, but one of the most common questions is, hey, can we increase, decrease units? What happens if the project kind of morphs a little bit from conditional to final award? So that is the time to make the adjustments. One of the things you can adjust is the amount of subsidy, or the amount that you've asked in support of that unit. So if you requested during the application process ESSHI funds in the amount of $18,500 per unit, that can't change from conditional to final award. That must be maintained. What can change a little bit, and sometimes we see this based on, you know, projects moving along that development milestone, is that the number of units at play may change. Sometimes we've seen a decrease in units because of actual configuration and unit size and that sort of stuff. And sometimes we've actually seen an increase because during the redesign process, there was an additional 1 or 2 units, 5 units, 10 units that became available. So from conditional to final award, the units can change, but what can't change is introducing a different population. So if you applied, you know, to work with survivors of domestic violence and chronically homeless families or something like that, your application and the needs around it were evaluated based on the scope of services for the intended target population. Introducing a new population into that equation, we can't really entertain because it wasn't outlined in the original application.
What about sites? Can you change a site along the way?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a yes and no. Sounds like a classic state answer, right? So it really depends, meaning that sites can change. And quite frankly, some applications don't even identify a state, right, or a site. But it depends on how it's being presented and where it's moved to. And the biggest thing that we look at is it staying within the same continuum of care for those areas, or the same catchment area if it's, you know, COC or other relevant data. Because again, at the application process, the need was put forth in part of the application based on statistical evidence of need. So, and there's a support component to that, whether it's, you know, the continuum of care or another supporting, you know, jurisdiction around the target population. So as long as it's kind of working within the same framework that was outlined in the application, we're good. If you have a project in Saratoga and you use Saratoga's COC as evidence of the need and you're moving it to Binghamton, that's where we're going to struggle because it's different COCs.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And I guess stating the obvious, but as you know, talking to your sort of designated state agency as these potential changes are being discussed, I guess would be better to do sooner than later, right? Or if you have a conditional award and you're, 10 months in and you're contemplating something to reach out right before sort of moving forward, I would think.
Agreed. It's one of those things that I can't emphasize enough. I know a lot of our state contracting agencies post the conditional awards, have a kickoff meeting, kind of welcoming everybody to that year's round and what to expect and, how to advance a conditional award to a final award. But it's really a two-way street that we want to know about your progress. So there is that kickoff, but I think all of my state contracting agency colleagues would agree that we want to hear from you. Even if, hey, we're 50% there, we're 75% there, we welcome those communications because that helps us get ready and can keep us in the know. And, it also alerts other, maybe you're going to pursue capital financing from HHAP. Staying with that state contracting agency and keeping them informed on the progress is key to ultimately advancing that project to a final award.
Rick, there's just a follow-up question in the chat. Just to clarify back to the question around what can you use ESSHI for, like of existing affordable units that are moving to supportive. Can people put in an application? Let's say there's a 50 unit building, all affordable. People are living there. They're not going to be, it's not a vacant building. Can they make those units supportive, and is that eligible?
I'm going to say, if you have a particular project, give me a call. We'll talk about it. But to your point, McLean, that presumably, and I think our questions and answers over the years have kind of speaks to this. If the project is occupied, that's a challenge for us because ultimately they don't meet the homeless definition. So the eligibility requirement isn't satisfied.
Yeah.
That's what we're kind of always looking for. There have been projects where, there's been an expanded, I can think of one out in Syracuse where it's 99 units and there was 3 new units or 9 units created during a rehab. Those 9 new units were created, were ESSHI. So there's a nuance to that, but generally, if it's an occupied building, you don't satisfy the definition of homelessness and it's not an eligible project.
Okay, thank you. There's a few questions on population, so maybe we'll kind of focus in on those for a few minutes. Rick, you had kind of went through the list of eligible populations at the beginning, which was helpful. Could you speak a little to sort of the process that's been in place over the last couple of years around the prioritization of certain populations and how you've approached that? And if there's any foreseen changes to that, anything you can say to what populations may be prioritized this year in the upcoming round? I think folks are just looking for some direction around that and how that works.
Sure. So in the last few years under the ESSHI RFP, we advanced what we call categories, which paired different target populations into categories. I think the last iteration for the last couple of years, category 1 was defined by the target populations of chronic homelessness, SMI, SUD. Category 2 was reentry, HIV, youth and young adults. Category 3 was survivors of domestic violence, military service, frail, elderly, seniors, and IDD. The way the conditional awards were advanced is that at least 50% of the conditional awards would be advanced for category 2, and then 25% for, maybe I said that wrong, at least 50% of the conditional awards were advanced for category 1, that being chronic homelessness, SMI, SUD. Then 25% would be advanced for category 2, which is reentry, HIV, youth, young adults, and then 25% for category 3. So at the end of the day, you had 50% of our conditional awards targeting chronic homelessness, SMI, SUD, and then categories 2 and 3 were equitably 25% each. In terms of what to take away from that is obviously, it provides some guidance and consideration of what we're trying to advance and where needs are and that sort of stuff. But I think that's an area of the year 6 RFP that I would highly recommend everybody to tune into, to take a look at, to read. We always do a question and answer period, and if there are additional questions, please use that opportunity. I think this year's RFP will kind of continue in further efforts that prior RFPs have outlined.
Great, thanks. And also someone was asking around the definition of eligible populations. Is there a category for people with significant physical disabilities?
Not at this time. I mean, that's certainly, there isn't, and I invite, again, any of my colleagues on the phone. Generally our experience has been that one of the other target populations would also be met, whether it's chronic homelessness or reentry and that sort of stuff, but just a physical disability, at this time, there isn't that separate category or target population, I should say.
And families, is there a family category?
Family is generally, and I look at Jason, generally when we talk about families, it's come under the chronic homelessness definitions. So chronic homelessness not only includes the singles, and if you go back to year 1, we used to say chronically homeless individuals, chronically homeless families. We've changed that, I don't know what year, maybe year 3-ish or something like that, where it's a broader category of just kind of chronic homelessness.
Yeah, I do want to highlight, we use the term a lot in there, qualifying individual. So while the funds can serve a family, a single or family, do understand that doesn't necessarily mean that all family members, that the agents, you could get 25,000 max per family member. It only goes to the individual you consider to be the qualifying individual per the definitions of the population of the RFP. So you can certainly provide services such as parenting, for that individual, and those services can kind of essentially drop down to the family members themselves. But I like to think of it too as whoever is actually going to have a case file, that qualifying individual, that's the person who you can claim the max 25,000 for, not each family individual.
Yep. This is Julie from OMH. I just want to add that, we would interpret the SMI category to incorporate individuals and families in the same way that we capture that with the chronic homeless population. So, certainly there is a need out there for SMI families, and we would encourage folks to consider serving that population. But it would fall under the general SMI category. And I think that applies to most of the population categories in ESSHI. There's an opportunity to serve families within those population designations.
That's a great clarity, Julie. Thank you. And we certainly have even veterans. We do veterans family housing as well under ESSHI. So to your point, Julie, family is kind of throughout all of that, the populations.
And on the funding side, it's still the same rate, right? It's up to 25,000 per unit, whether it's single or families.
Per qualifying individual.
Yeah. Okay, just want to flag that for folks. On the population side of things, thinking about it just from a oversight program management perspective, if you have a project that has multiple populations, how is it determined who will be your oversight agency? Is there sort of a general rule of thumb? How does that work?
Julie, do you want to take that or you want me to? It doesn't matter. I can keep going, but just to change the voice.
You've carried the ball for a long time. So yeah, I'd be happy to address that. So typically we assign contracting agencies based on who is served by the majority of the units in the project. So if the majority of the units are serving individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, then OTDA would be the contracting agency. But there is some flexibility within that. So when you get your conditional award letter, I think it speaks to like tentatively assigned or some similar language. And there may be circumstances where it makes sense to switch the contracting agency. If you have a relationship with a different agency or something. So certainly you could reach out once you get your conditional award if you thought it made sense to be assigned to a different state contracting agency. But generally speaking, when we do those initial assignments, it's based on which agency the majority of the units falls under.
If I could just add a couple reflections on that, because certainly one of the things that we see more and more in projects that have been advanced in the last couple of years is diversifying the target populations within an application. And generally that is kind of reflective of the needs in the community as well. So when that happens, certainly that results in a couple of different things on the state contracting agency. But I also want to highlight, and I'll talk about that in a minute, I also want to highlight that also for providers and potential applicants coming in, when you're diversifying the populations to be served, one of the things that we as reviewers are looking at for is the appropriateness of services for all the intended target populations. So, again, going back to an earlier example, if the project is proposing to serve survivors of domestic violence and young adults, the services that are being proposed to be supported with ESSHI should be mindful and considerate of both populations' needs. The service package with a young adult population, while there may be overlap with survivors of domestic violence, certainly there's a uniqueness to some of that service package that may not be applicable for survivors of domestic violence and vice versa. So I highly encourage, to be mindful of that when you're diversifying, that you're hitting all of the appropriateness towards the needs for each of the target populations. From a state level, while your state contracting agency would be assigned, if you have multiple target populations, there's a lot of sharing that happens through the work group, including sharing draft contracts, making sure that, you know, the scope of services is appropriate. You may see kind of joint, I know Jason and OPDB did some joint monitoring that's happened in the past. So there's a lot of sharing and active voices and insight that happens kind of the back end and the governance over that contract and the negotiation of that contract.
Great, thanks. Another question that came in was around Olmsted. This is back sort of on the capital side, I guess, of the equation, but when a project is being envisioned and put together, can you speak a little bit to the makeup of a residence? Like how many units, what is the percentage of units that can be supportive in a project? I know it's different for upstate, downstate. Can you speak a little bit to the parameters around that? And if it's different for different state agencies or the same across the board?
Sure. I'll start, and then I'm going to invite Julie and Trish to kind of weigh in. So Olmsted, again, just from a large perspective, puts up parameters around the number of units that can be integrated within a setting, and it sets a maximum rather than a minimum number of units. And it really centers on populations with disabilities. So I'll kind of hand it over to Julie if you want to talk about what OMH's expectations around Olmsted are, and then Trish, if you want to talk a little bit about IDD, and I'll conclude with OASIS.
Great, thanks, Rick. Yeah, I would, just make the general comment of encouraging people to take a look at the RFP when it comes out, because it is different for different populations. So that's, you're going to want to keep that in mind and take a look. But, generally speaking, for a project to be Olmsted compliant by OMH standards, no more than 50% of the units in the building can be disability specific upstate, and then we allow up to 60% in New York City. And again, I just want to clarify that that's all populations that are disability specific, all populations that fall under Olmsted. So if you are having a mix of populations, keep that in mind. It's not just only 50% can be SMI units, and then you could have another 10% that's SUD. You're going to need to keep that total number of disability specific units under that 50 or 60% cap. Conversely, though, not all populations that are served by ESSHI are disability specific and subject to Olmsted. So if you are incorporating units that are not disability specific, you don't need to factor those into your calculation. So if you are intending to serve a chronic homeless population, for example, that population wouldn't be counted in your disability specific number of units in your project.
So you could go over 60%.
Yes, if it's not disability specific. Yep.
Okay.
And we sometimes see that particularly in smaller projects. I mean, if we're talking a big project, I don't think we typically see much higher than that support of the units being supportive, but you may have a smaller project that you exceed that 50 or 60% of the supportive units because you're addressing the needs of a mix of populations.
Trish, do you want to talk a little bit from your agency's perspective?
Sure. This is Trisha Downs with OPWDD. We have a little bit different standard because anyone who serves the OPWDD supported folks recognizes that the vast majority of our non-housing related services are provided through Medicaid and our Medicaid waiver with the federal government. Because of that, the HCBS settings rule comes into effect for our folks, and the interaction with some other populations. So OPWDD limits the number of units that we allow in a project to no more than 25% of the units. And if you have a combination with other populations that also have a high Medicaid footprint, such as those supported by OMH or OASAS, we would limit the combination to 30%. So it's a little bit different, but it is clearly stated within the RFP what the expectation is. And if you have specific questions, you can ask them through the question process, and we can give you additional information as appropriate through there. But it is the interaction with the Medicaid services that augment any ESSHI services, housing related services that are provided, that puts the additional limitation on it.
And again, for those that may be serving an SUD population, I encourage you to reach out to OASIS in particular. But I think their general rule is our projects, they have a threshold. So they do recognize smaller projects. And I won't advance what that unit size, but smaller projects, there's some flexibility around the percentage. And then generally the larger projects, they follow suit with OMH in terms of the percentages, 50% in rest of state and 60% down in New York City.
Great, thanks.
I did.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm also trying to, if you see me look to the side, I'm trying to look at the chat too. I wanted to circle back a little bit on the renewal. I saw a question if there was going to be a specific renewal package, and maybe a little bit more on that process. So for those projects that will be entering into a renewal phase, our agents, not our agents, the state contracting agencies will be reaching out as to what the needs are. And I know from an OTDA lens, it'll be interactive with Grants Gateway and kind of renegotiating those contracts. So each state contracting agency will reach out to you what is needed in order to undertake those efforts. But I do encourage you, if you're one of those renewal contracting agencies and just want to get further details, call, send an email to your state contracting agency and get particulars. So, the timeline, we tried to begin to work with agencies, at least 6 months in advance of that. It can be 5 months. I realize we're in July turning to August, and we have some contracts that are due in January. So if you haven't heard from your state contracting agency and you're one of those entities that renewal is due in January, you should hear soon, but certainly feel free to reach out to them as well.
There's another question in the chat related to, it's a little bit of a twist on the existing project questions we were talking about earlier. If someone has an existing project, they're serving they have an ESSHI contract, it's at full capacity, they have another building that has some vacant units. Do you ever consider adding additional ESSHI units to an existing project? Would that happen? If so, does that happen through the renewal process? Have you seen that happen, or is that something you will do or not do?
We have not seen that. That's something certainly I'll take back. I'll give you the Rick opinion on that. So I'm going to qualify it, that Rick's perspective. I think adding units after a final award reserve would be challenging for the ESSHI work group, just because it was registered at OSC and there's a whole procurement background to that component. So that new project, if you will, I would think would require a separate application and a separate award, but I will never say never by any means. I don't know if Julie wants to add anything to that, but I think we would be challenged.
Yeah, that was my instinct too. I mean, we haven't encountered that before, so we need to look into it, but I can't envision how we could make that work.
Okay. And Paul, I see you have your hand up. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I guess one of my major questions is about the definition of homeless or previous homeless, because what's come up as we've talked about doing seniors transitioning out of nursing homes was we had to document they were homeless first. In our experience, when a person becomes disabled, oftentimes they may lose their housing while they're in the hospital for an extended period of time and they're single. So technically they're homeless, but they're in a hospital. And at this point in time, I know that the Department of Homeless Services will not admit anyone who has personal care attendant needs within the shelter system. We used to do that in our shelter at Barrier Free Living until the building was no longer viable and we had to tear it down. And we had the experience as a supportive housing provider of identifying, I think, 28 veterans, female veterans, who were in Ellenville, New York, who were in a substance abuse facility because they had all been victims of sexual assault in the military, who were New York City residents who couldn't come back to the city because they had no housing. But we were told, I'm sorry, they're not homeless because they're in a rehab facility. And the whole issue of what happens to what I call the hidden homeless, who, because there was no housing for them when they were hospitalized or no housing for them when they entered into that situation, that they end up stuck in an institution because they have no priority in the homeless system. And the homeless system has, and I can say because we've had people literally barred at the door when we have escorted people from our domestic violence emergency shelter to an intake center to say, you have a care attendant, you've hit the jackpot, you can't come in. What happens to those folks that may be not victims of domestic violence, but who are, in a hospital and have had no place to go, or they end up in a long-term care facility like Kohler or one of the other facilities in health and hospitals?
So you do reference kind of that eligibility requirement in ESSHI that persons referred must have been homeless prior to placement in hospitals or nursing homes, and we certainly recognize the challenges that can create. What I would say is that our colleague Moira has been wonderful at kind of brokering those conversations. If you want to send us an email, I'm sure we'll get back. And I'm not speaking for Moira, but Julie, she's been able to kind of leverage some conversations around populations, conversations with HRA down in the city to try to make it work for everybody. Would you agree?
Yeah, I certainly would agree. And I just, I don't know, do we have any of our DOH colleagues on the call? Because, I don't want to speak specifically to that frail elderly population, which is really where the
Agreed.
where the limit is for it's like nursing home referrals. So those are primarily that frail elderly. So I don't want to speak on their behalf, except to acknowledge that I hear your challenge, and I like Rick said, I mean, reaching out and letting us know the challenges you're facing, we can certainly help and negotiate those on a case-by-case basis.
Super.
I wanted to clarify the issue about the women veterans upstate. Those women veterans from that program, that's a Samaritan program, came from homeless shelters in New York City. They were referred from the homeless shelters to the residential programming upstate, so that once they were to leave, they of course would still be homeless because they entered that residential program homeless. And that, my understanding, when I was still working at Oasis and the Director of Housing, that program has been ongoing for a number of years, and that has always been the understanding with DHS, that they came from homeless shelters in New York City, referred for the residential treatment, and then the plan was for them to be able to go to permanent supported housing through ESSHI.
Thanks,
When
Bill.
we were opening our supportive housing, Samaritan Village was unable to document the formerly homeless piece, which is what left. We would have taken all 28 people into our program had that been able to be documented at the time.
Maybe that's a good question. I mean, Rick or Julie, could you speak to what the documentation is needed to satisfy that piece of it? Because that's newish, right? In the last
think-
couple of years.
Well, just in terms of documentation, you know, it's
The homeless piece.
yeah, it's the documentation of the homeless piece. So, you know, I'll kind of wrap up, Paul, and you know, we can take this offline and, you know, have a follow-up conversation and loop in Moira and our colleagues at DOH.
Great, thank you.
So I see a question, Linda writes in, is it possible to have more than one person in an ESSHI supportive one-bedroom apartment if you're planning a supportive housing project only serving a disabled population? Is there a total units allowed since it would be considered 100% supportive housing, looking at doing smaller projects? So let me first state that I would encourage you to call and have a conversation with the intended target population that you're proposing, because not all state contracting agencies based on the target population allow for kind of a doubled up scenario in supportive housing. So it's really target population driven. For those areas that do permit the doubling up in a supportive housing apartment, that each qualifying individual would be eligible for kind of that maximum reimbursement. So I think there's like a handful of projects that in a larger project, larger being maybe 20 units, there might be one room that's kind of configured in that way, or one apartment configured in that way. That being said, I also know, again, kind of that 5-year look back, there was one unit that I'm thinking of that was constructed with 2 qualifying individuals that would be in there. You know, initially during rent up, it happened. There was actually a disagreement. That person moved out, and now that one bedroom is kind of vacant and not being occupied, which obviously impacts the claiming component under ESSHI, and they're trying to work to resolve that. So I think based on the target population, you know, it should be mindful of the service needs and be mindful of the residents, whether that configuration can work, and that it's kind of driven by the needs of the intended population and the appropriateness of it. But there's no hard and fast rule across the board that it's a yay or nay. It's really based on the target population, whether or not it's permittable.
And if I could just add, going back to Rick's point about reaching out to the specific state agency for the population, I would recommend highly you reach out to your capital funders too, to make sure that, to hear what comments they may have on the possibility of doubling up, and if it's something that they entertain or would prefer you did.
Yep.
Great. Well, we have 10 minutes left this morning. So I think I'm going to ask, does anyone have any questions they want to just raise their hand and ask directly at this time? This is your last shot before the RFP opens in a few weeks, hopefully. All right. Well, we covered so much this morning. It was
I'm sorry, I couldn't find my hand raised, but I do have one more question. If we got, I'll make it really quick. When you talk about special homeless youth population, those of us that are runaway homeless youth providers, we get challenged other times to 16 and 17-year-olds. So can a homeless youth that meets other criteria that's under the age of 18, if the county has designated them as a head of household, be eligible for supportive housing through ESSHI?
Kathy, are you still on?
Yeah, hi, yeah, I'm here. In the RFP, I don't have it in front of me. It has the ages, and it's for foster care, if you were in foster care from the age 16 and 5 years within that time frame. So I believe we have one where it was 18, but I don't believe 16.
Isn't our definition of homeless?
The definition of homelessness, that was, if you saw my head, like go further into the camera, I'm trying to look at the RFP and pull it up in real time. Certainly we can circle back on that, but homeless, in order to be considered homeless for the purpose of the RFP, an individual must meet one of the following criteria. I think provision number 2 talks to be a youth or young adult who left foster care within the prior 5 years and who is in foster care at or over age 16, or is without permanent housing, permanent and stable housing. And then, Linda, to your point, provision 4, this is an or, it's not an and, it's an or. Be a young adult between the ages of 18 and 25.
25, yeah.
Yeah. So certainly we can follow up and have different conversations, but that's my quick dig in on that response.
Hi, I had a question as well. I can't find my hand to raise either. But for those of us who have year 5 awards and we're going to be reapplying for year 6, is there anything we should keep in mind? Any words of wisdom, advice for us when we're writing those applications?
So you have a conditional award for year 5 and you're going to be applying for year 6?
That's correct.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understood versus a renewal. So yeah, I'm so excited that you answered this question or asked this question. You get my gold star award for the day. One of the things that I highly encourage is everybody read the RFP. We are advancing some flexibilities as we talked about the 24-month. There are different things in every year. We evaluate the questions that we ask in the RFP and kind of match that against the responses, meaning we asked this question in a way, did we get the responses that were anticipated, or do we need to fine tune the questions to try to get at what we were asking? We kind of do that self look back. We ask all the reviewers for feedback and trying to pair it. So sometimes from year to year, the questions feel a little bit but we may have nuanced it because maybe we didn't ask it in the way that it was intended to. So one of the biggest takeaways, and we've seen this happen over the last 5 years, because it's not substantial changes, but we see, you know, kind of a, hey, this got funded last year. Let me copy and paste and bring it forward and change some dates and maybe bring in the new point in time data from the COC. And we've seen some kind of missteps there because that questions were changed in a way that last year's responses didn't always match. So my biggest words of encouragement is read the RFP, read it early, ask your questions during the question and answer period, because that's really a great time that if we lacked clarity around something, that we can provide that clarity for consideration to incorporate in your application. And then in terms of the actual responses to the questions, kind of read the question and make sure that you're thoroughly responding to the question. And to my points earlier, that if you have a diversified population that you're intending to serve, please speak to kind of the needs, the service package for each of the target populations. Probably the most common pitfall that we often see is an application is slanted heavily towards one target population, their needs, the services associated with it, but the application doesn't really speak to all the other applications. And that significant kind of compromises some of those applications and the competitiveness.
And if I could add on that particular note from Rick with the multiple populations, it is possible that you partner with another agency to subcontract for their services to provide for a population that you may not have a lot of experience with. It's possible to do that. Most definitely mention that partnership in your application, but also speak to their experience and what services they're going to be providing. And so, you know, we understand that the application is for you and for what, you know, your agency alone will be doing, but also if you're in one of those situations, we need to still hear what services will be provided by the partner agency for the population in question there.
Great. Well, 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask, is there any, Julie, Kathy, Patricia, any other words of wisdom or things you would like to highlight before we close out?
I'd just like to, you know, again, thanks everybody for, you know, showing up today and listening to our little song and dance. And, you know, as I think Rick and Jason said earlier, you know, right now before the RFP has been released, if you have a project in mind that you have questions about, you know, please reach out to, you know, the appropriate state agency, and we'd be happy to talk through the project with you and troubleshoot with you. But it's important that you do that now if you have those questions, because once the RFP is on the street, we're in a blackout period and we can't entertain those discussions then. But, you know, we're happy to work with you to develop a successful project now. So please reach out.
Oh, Richard?
I have one question. When will the recording be available?
Yeah, we'll be sending the recording of this as well as the session on Tuesday out in the next couple days to all the registrants. So look for that in your email. And I have to say, Rick, I don't know if you feel differently, but this session was different, quite different than Tuesday. So there's some similar topics, but a little different. So I would encourage you to take a listening of time.
Certainly the questions, I agree. The questions were a little bit different. It probably had to do with a bit of the kind of capacity, and but I agree. The one thing before we close, putting our capital hats on, Michelle, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit where HCR is with some of their funding, just for a general awareness.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Rick. Hi, everyone. This is Michelle I'm on the HFA side, on the 4% side. So just some context there. I think we're also coming up to a close of the housing plans and subsidies in general, right? We're always looking to save and maximize our strategies. And in terms of our supportive housing, right, we're always looking to max out our supportive housing units per year. I think I would just reiterate a lot of what the working group has said, that to keep constant communication open with the state contract agencies, as things do tend to change throughout the financing cycle. I think one of the things we're very excited about is the 24-month conditional award letter that will help us, right? Because sometimes there are unforeseen delays, but I think now that we're leaving we're not leaving, we're still in the pandemic, but a lot of the construction prices that also delayed some projects seem to be coming back down. So there's a lot of cost savings that can happen there. But I think some of the other items too that I would point out is do reach out to us if you are interested in, I think Jason said this before, coupling up specific populations within the same unit. I think we also want to make sure we're being as equitable in our process, but that's it for now. I think there's definitely more that comes out. Obviously, the more clarity we have on the rents we can underwrite to from the beginning in the process, the better. But that's not always possible. So it's always great to keep an open line of communication.
Great. And then just as a reminder for those that aren't aware, the Homeless Housing Assistance Program, we continue to accept applications under HHAP. That's our capital program. So that currently is up on our website. If you're interested in pursuing those funds, it's highly recommended that you use our concept paper process, which is a one-pager about what your initiative is. You submit it to our office, and then we provide kind of some feedback, and it's helpful to avoid some pitfalls, could even be around ownership structure and that sort of stuff. So a little bit about that program, and if you want more on it, feel free to reach out to myself. So
Great. Well, thanks again to everyone for joining. We'll send out the recording in the next few days, so keep an eye out for that. And thanks again to Rick, Julie, all of our presenters. We really appreciate your time and expertise and advice to help us advance year 6. So looking forward to it. Have a great afternoon, everyone.